I ask you, what's the global currency? What's the first thing that pops up in your head? Is it gold, oil, or Bitcoin? Most of you will answer US dollars. But what if I tell you that the US dollar is under threat? The Chinese Yuan is trying to dethrone the US dollar from its global supremacy. If that happens, the value of your money will drop significantly. The prices of goods will rise even higher due to inflation. The $100 bill may not be the largest denomination in US currency. US dollars is involved about 90% of Forex liquidity. As of the fourth quarter of 2022, the dollar accounts for 58% of the foreign reserve, and for decades, US dollars has been the world's primary reserve currency. US dollar accounts for 60% of all international debt. Most traders denominate in dollars, and most reserves in central banks around the world are in US dollars. It is also the primary reserve asset for many international agencies. The US dollar is the global currency. But for how long? In this video, I'll go over the threats that the dollar is facing, why it's facing these threats, and what would happen if any of these threats comes true. Hi, I'm Mirza. I'm a realtor and a diversified investor, and on this channel, I make finance videos less threatening. Now, this is not the first time that the dollar has been challenged. It was Europe that tried to dethrone the dollar from its dominance. But then comes the European debt crisis, which was a multi-year debt crisis in the European Union, and the euro crashed. Then comes the yuan or renminbi. It's crucial for Chinese President Xi Jinping's agenda for the yuan to take over US dollars. By doing this, not only he's going to be able to paint a picture of the global economic reform, but also become a hero at home and around the world. It will make the Chinese currency the foreign reserves of choice, which will make China the global superpower, hence global domination. The main reasons are to reduce its reliance on dollar, which would serve as a buffer against potential US sanctions, and to get greater control over its economy. The recent intensification of this effort is driven by geopolitical concerns and fear of sanctions similar to those that Russia faced after its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And following by Russia's playbook, China is also trying to do the same thing with Taiwan. If the Chinese yuan were to take over US dollars as a dominant global currency, it could potentially have significant effect on global economy and specifically on the United States. The US enjoys significant benefit from issuing the world's primary reserve currency, a concept known as seigniorage. This means the US can borrow money at lower cost because of its always high demand of its currency. If the yuan becomes dominant currency, China would gain these benefits instead. Currently, many international contracts, especially for commodities, are priced in dollar. If the yuan becomes a global currency, these contracts might be repriced in yuan. This could increase costs for US businesses and consumer if the dollar weakens against the yuan. The US has been able to exert influence over countries through its control of the dollar-based global economy systems, for example, by enforcing sanctions. If the yuan takes over, China might gain more geopolitical power and influence. The transition from the dollar to the yuan would likely cause short to medium-term financial market instability. Markets don't like uncertainty, and such a significant change would create plenty of it. Currently, the US can run large deficits without causing alarm in the international financial markets, largely due to its dollar status. If the yuan takes over, the US might face higher borrowing costs and thus could be compelled to implement more restrained fiscal policies. If the dollar loses value, a result of the yuan taking over, imported goods in the US could become more expensive, which would lead to inflation. This could impact the standard of living in the US. China has long wanted to make yuan a global force and has mounted significant efforts to do so, such as launching cross-border interbank payment systems (CIPS), issuing the world's first yuan-dominated crude oil future contracts, extend loans to dozens of developing countries, and developing a digital yuan. The effort goes back to 2008 during the global financial crisis. Here are some key steps China is taking to dominate the global currency. Belt and Road Initiative. It is a global infrastructure development strategy that aims to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe via land and maritime networks. This was adopted by Chinese government back in 2013 to invest in more than 150 countries and international organizations. And some of these projects are partly financed in yuan and in local currency, or in other words, it's a debt trap. Report claims that 14 countries in Africa are now using yuan as their reserve. The plan is simple. Use investment in the infrastructure sector for these poor nations and then bully them into using yuan as their currency. For instance, Zimbabwe is one of the countries where inflation hit so hard that their own currency lost its value. They were using US dollar as their currency, but now they have to use Chinese Yuan along with US dollars. Blockchain. Then China tried to use blockchain technology to create its own digital currency, as it's widely believed that only a global digital currency can take over US dollar. Plan started back in 2014, and in 2016, on China's National Economic Plan, blockchain advancement was added. In 2019, Xi Jinping asked to accelerate the development of blockchain. Now, it's unclear that if Chinese businesses will welcome this new digital currency, but their acceptance will be mandatory. Exactly how they force their currency in Africa, they will force their own people to accept this new digital currency. Not only their own people, but every single one of the American companies that are doing business in China, and every multinational companies will have to accept this new currency if they want to continue business in China. In 2009, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and later South Africa partnered and created BRICS partnership. That was created for a new world order. They were the emerging market, and China wanted to make sure to increase the amount of Chinese Yuan bonds that these countries were holding. There has been some issues between China and India due to the virus and some political turmoil. However, the relationship between Russia and China are better than ever due to the sanctions that was posted by the United States because of the invasion. De-dollarization. No, this is not an anecdote that I just created for this video. This is an actual term. In the last few months, if you have browsed YouTube or any other social media platforms, you should be able to see this term trending, along with Chinese Yuan just flipped US dollars, US dollar is dying, and many more. Now, propaganda has been known as the first chapter of any authoritative government's handbook. China has billions of dollars for marketing campaign to spread propagandas like these in the Western society, along with everywhere in the world. In order to paint a picture how American economy is dying or even dead, how China is taking over the world and everything else, it helps them solidify the mirage that they are trying to create. In 2018, Russia sold 100 billion US dollars from its reserves and distributed among euro and yuan. Russia is even trading with Indian rupees and euros. Russia is not only trying to pull the dollar down, but also pushing the yuan up. It acquired a quarter of world's yuan in reserves. In a recent deal, China's state-owned China National Offshore Oil Corporation struck a deal with France's giant Total Energies in yuan for liquefied natural gas. China and Saudi Arabia are closing in on an agreement where China would pay in yuan to Saudi Arabia for oil. In recent years, it has made agreement with a number of other countries to use yuan for bilateral trade. Countries such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, Bangladesh, India, Argentina, Brazil, Pakistan, Iraq, and Bolivia have traded in yuan or expressed their willingness to do so. However, the chance of yuan replacing the dollar in the global reserve currency in near future is considered very low. Due to the stringent capital control in China, the lack of transparency of its financial market, and the relatively low volume of yuan in global payments and reserve. And it only has been few years since 2015 that yuan is recognized as a foreign reserve by International Monetary Fund or IMF. Yet it is the only currency in the IMF basket that is not free-floating. For a currency to be traded globally, it needs to be stable. From 2015 and 2016 yuan devaluation, and as recent as 2019 the yuan first broke 7-to-1 price parity against US dollar, does not come across as very stable. For a currency to be global, its economy needs to be transparent to the entire world. And as we all know it, transparency and China does not go in the same sentence. The world has no idea about the country's monetary policy. China's economy is largely controlled by the capital. And for a currency that wants to be global, its economy cannot be inaccessible to the world. And this channel's economy depends on your participation in clicking the like and subscribe button below. All the numbers and graphs aside, the most important strong suit for US dollar is its trust. And for Chinese currency, not so much. Even China knows about it. All the steps that China has taken thus far in order to dethrone US dollars from the global economy hasn't really been that successful. The Belt and Road Initiative didn't really go anywhere, and many countries are now regretting cutting the deal. Brazil cutting the deal with China to promote its socialist agenda and to throw shade towards US. France trying to be the big guy by becoming the movers and shakers of the world economy by cutting a deal with China didn't really pan out as expected. The dollar is known as the Petro Dollar, which means all the oil trades that takes place around the world uses uses US dollar as a transaction metric and as a form of payment between countries. This idea is embedded with it that if a trade takes place in US dollars, that means US controls that trade. But that's far from the truth. United States does not have any control over its exchange rate, nor it can control any trade that's happening around the world, whether it's in US dollars or not. US cannot force any country to make transactions only with US dollars. But why do countries do that? US financial market is deeper, more sophisticated, and more liquid than any other. It's transparent to the world. Yuan itself is less convertible than the US dollar or the euro. Hence, US dollar is more trusted and stable. It has a huge economy, which makes its countries transact in US dollars. And since competition is good for business, most of the prices and quotes are US dollars for price comparison. For instance, if I'm selling oil and you want to buy oil from me in yuan, I will give you the converted price in yuan from US dollars. Once you pay me in yuan, I will convert it back to US dollars, so the transaction happening in yuan does not mean dollar is being challenged in the global economy. And this is not only in oil industry. All the other commodities such as metal, oil, soybeans are all traded in US dollars. Majority of all future contracts in these commodities are held in US dollar. However, it's not all rainbows and butterflies for US dollars either. Maybe the threat is more greater at home than outside. As US dollars is used as a reserve currency of the world, which is kind of like a savings account for countries, its role as a savings account might slowly shrink, or rather shrinking. US lawmakers are kind of shooting themselves in the foot. There's been a lot of fuss about the US debt ceiling, which is like the country's credit limit. The way the lawmakers have been handling it has been hurting people's trust in the US's ability to pay back its debt, which could be a bad news for dollar's reputation. The dollar's popularity has been getting a bit less over the last 20 years, and it even took a hit last year. The dollar's share of the global reserve dropped 8%. Some countries are also use more gold as a way to depend less on the dollar. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that in a recent meeting in Congress that there's no other currency ready to take the dollar's place. But she also said that the countries might keep fewer dollars in their reserve as they try to mix things up a bit. It's like not putting all your eggs in one basket. With ongoing trade wars with China, sanctions with Russia and other countries has made some countries, including longtime allies, think about using other currencies more. Despite all of this, Yellen believes that the dollar will stay up on top. According to some number crunching by the International Monetary Fund, the dollar made up more than half of the world's foreign exchange reserves at the end of last year. The euro was in the second place with a bit over 20%, and the Chinese Yuan, which some people think that could challenge the dollar, only accounted for less than 3%. Most experts think that the dollar will keep the crown for now. They don't see any major changes coming soon because there's really no other good option for international trade. Unless China figures out a way to connect yuan to gold, it is highly unlikely that it will ever take over US dollar. A gold-backed currency was the key for one small economy like Holland, then England, and finally United States. That has turned into a global powerhouse. There you have it. As always, if you like the vibe, join the tribe. Thank you for hanging out with me. See you in the next video. As it's widely believed that only global didn't really pan out as accepted. Didn't really pan out as accepted. Didn't really pan out as didn't really pan out as accepted, as expected, as expected, as expected.